welcome to I think this is the third of the Hyde lecture series for this semester. So Hyde lecture series is a public lecture series of the College of Architecture here at University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where we have conversations about important topics in the built environment. And this year, our topic is advancing house, planning and designing for houseful places. And so this is really provocative series on nice special effect there. Provocative series on the ways we shape the built environment and how that has implications, and how our work improves and enhances public health, both individually and collectively as a society. So I'm really excited to have Michael Grove over here today as our speaker. So Michael is the chair of the landscape architecture practice at SASAKI, but actually the more accurate term is LA plus CE, so landscape architecture, civil engineering, and ecologies. And SASAKI, for those of you who don't know, it's a widely respected international and interdisciplinary practice. They've done a lot of important and forward-thinking projects over the years. My first encounter with SASAKI Associates and their work, and that's even before I started my path as a landscape architect, is their master plan for the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which is probably done almost 20 years ago. And the ecological components of that master plan project still left a lot of important ecological assets that's still growing, very much growing even to this day. And you have to consider that's in the context of what is a traditionally very heavy sort of hardscape, hard infrastructure, hard building investment type of project. So that master plan is really forward-thinking in that respect. And most recently, a project in Greece where they've transformed a deserted piece of infrastructure and old airport into a vibrant ecological places, and there's also a huge carbon sequestration piece as part of it, which is again very exciting work. And Michael is behind a lot of those important work. And also beyond his role as SASAKI Associates, he's also a fellow at the American Society of Landscape Architects. He sits on the Place Making Council of the urban. Sorry, I need to find my note here. Apologize. It's yeah. No worries. And also he sits as a current president on the Landscape Architecture Foundation. So all very important work that he's doing, both inside his own his practice as SASAKI Associates, and also overall as for the entire discipline. So I'm really excited to have Michael here. He has always been a source of inspiration for me personally, and I'm sure what he has to share today will be informative and insightful for many of you as well. So without further ado, let's, actually a few other small quick things. First, if you haven't scanned your card for the Husker sensing and your class does require it, it's available in the back after the end of the lecture. And secondly is the Q&A. So we will have a Q&A section. We maybe have 5, 6, 7 questions to talk about things at the end. So feel free to note down things, think about questions you like to ask. This is a great occasion to be able to engage with the speaker. So I highly encourage all of you to think about questions that you're interested in exploring after the end of the formal lecture. And then, without further ado, I'll present to you Michael Grove.
Thanks, Yuja, for making me feel really old when you cite projects that are like over 20 years old. That's kind of crazy. And thank you all for coming. I'm really honored to be with you all today. Back in Nebraska, I was here back in May, so it's nice to be here again. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to share my optimism for the future of landscape architecture and really the importance of shouting from the rooftops what landscape architects in combined collaboration with allied disciplines can do to really shape the world. I'm going to take you on a bit of a whirlwind adventure today, so bear with me. First, though, there's a few things I want you to know about me that will set the stage for this lecture. This is where I grew up, suburban hell. This is a cul-de-sac outside of Cleveland, Ohio. But this landscape shaped who I am more than any other. And it was actually pretty great. My backyard was a decent-sized wooded area with what I thought when I was 6 years old was the most enchanted creek in the whole world. These pictures aren't of me, but I spent hours in that creek, skipping rocks, searching for frogs and salamanders, building islands and waterfalls. And it was really my very first canvas. As an only child growing up in the free-range parenting style of the 1980s, that creek was also my best friend. As I grew up, my bike expanded my access to even more landscapes. In Cleveland, I was surrounded by the emerald necklace of the Metro Park system. My bike was really my chariot, carrying me to even bigger landscapes that are shaped by glaciers as they melted and formed the Great Lakes. And it carried me to design landscapes too, landscapes that I didn't necessarily know were designed at the time, like Stan Hewitt Hall and the Gwynn Estate by Warren Manning, or the Cleveland Mall, obviously by Daniel Burnham. But in spite of those incredible experiences, for my entire childhood, I was really embarrassed of where I was from. Cleveland was referred to as the mistake on the lake, or the city where the river caught fire. Though because of that, we now have the Environmental Protection Agency, so you're welcome. But in the 1990s, things started changing. As a teenager, I became totally obsessed with the transformation of downtown Cleveland. I often took the light rail into the city to observe this urban metamorphosis. And I started to do some research, which was essentially research that led me to landscape architecture and eventually to SASAKI, which happened to be the design firm behind many of those evolving urban landscapes that contributed to Cleveland's Renaissance and my ideal of what an urban condition could be through the power of landscape architecture. It was at the same time that my best friend, Nat Creek, who I was still close to, even as a teenager, I will admit, I spent a lot of time out there. But that creek betrayed me. It turned out it was the stormwater runoff from the mall parking lot up the hill. And so my entire childhood was spent splashing around in hydrocarbons, which was not awesome. And then one day I was at the library and I stumbled upon Landscape Architecture magazine. I think I was probably 14 or 15 years old, and it really rocked my world. The magazine has happily evolved quite a bit in both layout and content over the years, but I quickly discovered that I didn't have to be just an architect who thought about kind of an object, but there was something different, something that was larger about systems and how they were interrelated, and I was kind of starting to piece that all together as a disillusioned teenager based on my experiences with that creek. Around the same time, I became obsessed with Ian McHarg, Design with Nature, which is his seminal writing, really became my Bible. In his writings, I finally had a vocabulary that synced with my internal monologue. And it also gave me kind of a bit of a smart-ass rebuke to any family member that questioned my chosen career path or asked if I cut grass or something like that. So this is still one of my favorite quotes. We're going to talk to you about survival. That's what we do as landscape architects. So I was really emboldened then by a clear sense of purpose. I started researching college programs. I went to Cornell to major in landscape architecture. I met this guy, Marv Edelman, who was one of Hideo Sasaki's students at Harvard and among the first employees of the firm in 1953. And when I was in school, Marv took our class on a trip to Boston to visit a number of firms, including Sasaki, and the rest has fallen into place for me since that moment. Based on all that backstory, I've frequently been told how lucky I am, lucky to discover landscape architecture when I was a kid, lucky to have landed a job at an intellectually stimulating and nurturing firm, and lucky to travel the world for so many incredible projects like you, John, noted. In fact, there's so many amazing quotes about being lucky in life that it's mind-boggling, but for me, none of that was luck. What it was privilege. Privilege to me isn't the presence of perks and benefits, it's the absence of obstacles and barriers. And that's a lot harder to notice sometimes. I was privileged to have a childhood where I could explore. I was safe. I was also privileged to have teachers who guided me. I was privileged to have parents who never pressured me to be like them, a police officer and a nurse. And I was privileged to have professors who nurtured me and encouraged my interests, like hopefully many of you do, and who introduced me to the thoughtful and empathetic people at a firm that forever changed my life. Fast forward to the formative years of my career. Again, growing up in Ohio, my world was pretty small. My family didn't travel much, but when I was about 14, we went to a relative's wedding in London, and then over to Paris. And again, I was hooked. I was always an explorer in that creek in my backyard, but this was different. It was new food, new cultures, and a built environment that looked nothing like anything I knew. I went to SASAKI exclusively because of the firm's international practice, and I made it very clear that that was the type of work I wanted to pursue professionally. It was and still is the perfect opportunity, I think, to see the world and get paid for doing it. This is the image I think most of my friends and family had in mind whenever I mentioned that I'm traveling for work. But as we all know, this is the reality. Travel isn't glamorous, and I didn't want to work on international projects because I enjoy spending so much time on an airplane. I chose the path of global practice because every experience I have brings me joy. I think that travel is really only glamorous in retrospect. The lived, shared experiences that travel affords are joyful, they're memorable, and to me, they're life-affirming. Travel connects me with my teams, my clients, and the communities in which we work, and to all of you. And also, I think, to the essence of place itself. Landscape architecture is a place-based profession, and we should spend every moment possible immersing ourselves in new experiences. One of the many things that brings me joy is expanding access to parks in the various places I'm privileged enough to work. But before I share some project examples, which I will, let's start with a little bit of a brief history lesson. So in recent years, scholars have devoted a lot of effort to estimating the holistic value of the benefits of parks and landscape architecture in general. These studies definitely aren't free of bias and limitations, but they contribute to our knowledge of the benefits that large parks produce and the methodologies that can be used to estimate them. To summarize, large parks play a very vital role in the environmental, the economic, and the cultural and physical well-being of cities and their residents. This is not a new concept. It's essentially the impetus of why the profession of landscape architecture was founded. Even prior to the great public parks of Europe, the New World and its tabula rasa presented an opportunity to rethink the spatial organization of cities and the integration of open space into them. One of the primary goals of Oglethorpe's plan for Savannah was to essentially democratize access to open space, mainly for use as a productive commodity, but also as part of a civic trust for public use. The plan for Savannah was, I think, again, really one of the earliest examples of the democratization of public space in America. But for quite some time, things went downhill after that, thanks to the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Giant sprawling cities developed, which began to really emphasize the luxuries of wealth and the cruelty of poverty in really sharp juxtaposition. More on that in a bit. To say that the history of large urban parks is complicated is really an understatement. For example, Birkenhead Park near Liverpool, designed by Joseph Paxton, is generally acknowledged as the first publicly funded civic park in the world. Birkenhead opened in 1847 after an act of parliament allowed the local government to use public money to buy about 226 acres of grazing land at the urban fringe. Plots kind of surrounding the proposed park were then sold off to finance its construction. But others argue that Derby Arboretum, designed by John Claudius Loudon, who, fun fact, actually coined the term arboretum to refer to a collection of plants for scientific study. Derby Arboretum opened 7 years prior to Birkenhead in 1840 and was really the inspiration for Birkenhead. Now, there's nuance here. Even though Derby Arboretum was publicly owned and operated, it was built following a donation of the land by a local philanthropist. So not exactly the first publicly funded public park. The example set by the English was soon followed by other European capitals, often in the form of land formerly reserved for nobility, becoming available to the masses. In Paris, Napoleon III ordered the Bois de Boulogne and the Bois de Vincennes to be opened up to the public. And again, in Madrid, Carlos III had already given public access to the gardens of the Palacio del Buen Retiro for recreational purposes, with the park becoming municipal property in about the mid-19th century. In fact, the complexities around funding and the intricacies of public-private partnerships continued throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and I think they really still persist today. For example, in 1895 in Philadelphia, a group of influential private citizens petitioned the city to buy about 65 acres of land along the Schuylkill River. The city decided not to acquire that land at the time. It took another wealthy group to kind of go ahead and purchase about 153 acres of the former Lansdowne estate, which is the Penn family estate. And then they transferred that to the city in 1867 after the assembly authorized the expropriation of about 2,000 acres, which really proved that massive public works projects could be handled effectively by an alliance by public and private sectors. Most famous example is obviously Central Park, where an article in the New York Evening Post in 1844 defended the need to create, quote, an extensive area for shade and recreation on the island of Manhattan. That article was essentially the beginning of the end for the original Manhattan Plan of 1811, which was essentially a swarm of houses organized in kind of a mesh grid that covered the entire island. In the end, these efforts were arguably intended for the betterment of public health and were essential to the further growth of urban populations, though often at the expense of the most vulnerable, like those at Seneca Village, which was the first free black community in New York City, located on the land of Central Park today. As the development of Central Park grew closer to Seneca Village, newspapers and politicians began to use covert racism to describe the village as a shanty town filled with squatters and scoundrels. Residents of Seneca Village fought to keep their community intact, but in 1857 the city used eminent domain to forcibly remove them. And thus the parks movement was solidified. Supporters believed that the opportunity for outdoor recreation would have a civilizing effect on the working class. This may have been a tangential benefit, but the primary outcome was the demonstration that the creation of parks could greatly enhance real estate values, allowing the rich to get richer under the veil of providing for the common good. Olmsted himself wrote that the purpose of a park was for the sanitary advantage of breathing, but Olmsted didn't believe that all classes could be trusted to properly enjoy Central Park. A large part of the people of New York are ignorant to a park, he wrote. They will need to be trained to the proper use of it and restrained in the abuse of it. So what are the contemporary impacts to physical and mental health, the economy, and the environment resulting from investment in large parks? Let's break it down with some statistics and some lessons learned. And since the parks movement really was all about health, let's start there. Research shows that easily accessible green environments encourage physical exercise. Residents living adjacent to large parks have lower levels of disease and illness than other people of similar income levels. And research conducted on North American urban parks indicates that the percentage of park users engaging in moderate to physical activity ranges from 18 to 62% higher than those without access to large parks. And also that those living within about a 10-minute walk to a large park spent on average 5.4 more hours per week on recreational and physical activities. How we design large parks also matters. The RAND Corporation found that parks with walking loops have 80% more users than parks without, and a 90% higher level of physical activity. So how does that translate to measurable health results? According to the City Parks Alliance, parks also reduce the costs of healthcare, saving approximately $1,861 in healthcare costs per person per year. While the effects of parks on mental health are in part attributed to that exercise, other studies indicate that simply spending time in parks, regardless of activity, contributes to lower levels of stress and higher levels of self-reported life satisfaction, happiness, and feelings that life is worthwhile. So just that as a baseline, I think, is enough to make the argument that parks are good for people. In New York, as the proximity to urban green space increased, the rate of emergency room visits related to all mental disorders decreased by about 35%. The same study also noted that as tree canopy cover levels increased, emergency room visits decreased even further. So it's not necessarily just access to the park, it's the quality of the park and the amount of trees and canopy within those parks, essentially access to nature. And then finally, a study conducted by the US Department of Agriculture found that tree cover in Toronto removed 1,430 metric tons of air pollution, including cobalt, nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxide, ozone, and inhalable particulate matter. We also noted as like PM10 and PM2.5, and that was valued at over $20 million in avoided healthcare costs per year just in Toronto. Which leads us to the economic benefits of large parks. Again, the National Recreation and Park Association, in a study with George Mason University, found that the impact of large urban parks generates $218 billion to the US economy annually and supports over 1.3 million jobs. And a study by the Trust for Public Land revealed that New York City's parks and open spaces alone provide $2.75 billion in annual economic benefit to New York. And another study by the Trust for Public Land and the Philadelphia Parks Alliance found that Philadelphia's public parks save the city more than $1 billion a year, which is 100 times more than what the city spends on them annually. That's an incredible investment. Yet, the 87 largest cities in the United States, the median annual spending on parks and recreation per resident is only $73. So we're not investing in what is proven to have economic and significant health benefits. The environmental benefits of large parks, I think, is probably the most important in an era of accelerated climate change, and also correlates to their economic benefits. The carbon storage of public parks can vary by ecoregion and by land use typologies. It also needs a lot more research, but another study by the US Department of Agriculture found that the largest urban parks in about 55 cities in the US store anywhere from 4.5 to 40.7 metric tons of carbon dioxide per acre. And it's also not just trees. A study published in March in the journal Nature Climate Change shows that large parks have a similar amount of carbon stored in their soils as in the soils of natural areas. Researchers studied 56 parks and natural ecosystems across 17 countries on 6 continents with a range of environmental gradients, and found that surface soils beneath dominant vegetation in urban parks and in natural ecosystems were equally biologically active. So we can create these natural spaces that have the same environmental benefits as untouched areas. And finally, we know that large parks help to reduce heat in cities, and that temperatures are cooler toward the center of a park than around its edges, sometimes by as much as 13 degrees Fahrenheit, especially parks with, again, significant tree cover. So, with all that background, you're now armed with all kinds of statistics to go out in the world and kind of tell everyone we need more parks. I'm going to walk you through a couple of case studies of work that we've done at SASAKI, starting in Shanghai, where we were engaged to design the first of 8 new green wedges that are planned for the city. And today, Zhangjiabang Park is one of the largest public parks in the city of Shanghai. A key design consideration for us was to instill in citizens an appreciation of the natural systems and the complex ecologies of the region. Woodlands were a main component, providing that urgently needed forest habitat, which is lacking in the hyper-urban context of Shanghai. And so our primary goal was to increase the park's tree cover from an existing condition that was about a fragmented 5% coverage to a proposed contiguous 48% coverage throughout the park. Zhangjiabang's complex forest ecosystem offers diverse wildlife habitats, produces over 1,000 tons of oxygen a year, and creates a more comfortable microclimate. A thorough understanding of the authentic ecology of the region influenced a woodland restoration strategy that encouraged biodiversity in multiple forest layers, which are more typical of Shanghai's native landscapes, but really forgotten in the city's contemporary human-centric landscape. In addition to the woodlands, wetlands were another key transformation on the site. Channelized concrete canals were transformed into sinuous riparian corridors to improve water quality and rebuild the biodiversity of the aquatic system. The park's 114 acres of restored wetlands will provide an estimated $2 million in ecosystem services annually, while removing about 78% of nitrogen and 49% of phosphorus in the existing Zhangjiabang Canal, really improving its water quality. And I think this proves the power of large parks to significantly promote and improve the health of the land and around us, and also the people that they serve. A new nature center and conservation hatchery also were designed to support those regional aquatic systems, but more importantly, to really connect city dwellers with the power of nature. That hopefully inspires another kid like me to become a landscape architect. And I think that's the ultimate goal and the thread that you'll see in a lot of the work that we do at SASAKI. Also in Shanghai, we're working to rethink how big urban infrastructure, like an elevated transit line and an aging stadium, can have a stronger connection to landscape. The existing Hanko Stadium's going right now through an epic transformation to bring it up to FIFA standards, with the goal of one day hosting the World Cup, but also to create a health and wellness destination that's more closely connected to nature. Our strategy was remarkably simple. Extend the existing park next to the stadium through it, lift it to meet the elevated light rail line, and then infuse a variety of new recreational programs to make it a vibrant destination. We also saw an opportunity to rethink underutilized space beneath the existing light rail infrastructure. We call it the midline, kind of a tongue-in-cheek nod in Shanghai's answer to the High Line, which creates a miles-long path above city streets while also connecting to the entry podium of the stadium. Where spectators once had to descend stairs and cross a busy road to access the stadium, they can now directly access it via public transit. Most importantly, though, we pulled that park again right through the stadium itself. This allows people to freely watch the action on the field as they meander through the landscape. This makes the experience, again, a much more democratic one, going back to those roots of landscape as a democratizing element. And it eliminates the notion that watching the game in person is an activity reserved only for those who can afford a ticket. At the upper levels of the stadium, a new cantilevered ring supports a variety of community recreational programming that's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, again, even on game days, with a public green roof offering panoramic views of the Shanghai skyline. And I think this is a really great example of how architects and landscape architects worked in seamless collaboration throughout the entire process. Now, growing up in suburbia and then watching the transformation of Cleveland instilled in me a deep curiosity and love for cities. I'm constantly inspired by their vibrancy, their complexity, and their diversity. So another thing that brings joy to my work is the opportunity not only to visit new cities, but to envision them as greener, more connected, and more equitable places that allow humanity to thrive. Again, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the design of our cities really required a paradigm shift because of societal pressures and a reaction against the disorder and inequity of the industrial age. In the United States, people were dying from epidemic diseases as a result of poor sanitation, and this is still very much the case in many parts of the developing world today. But at that time in the United States, urban slums, congestion, disorder, ugliness, and the threat of disease provoked a reaction, which these improvements to the sanitary conditions was really meant to be the first priority. Significant betterment of public health resulted from engineering improvements in water supply and sewerage, which were essential for further growth of those urban populations. And often landscape architects were leading those efforts. Now, mirroring the impetus for the parks movement in the US in the 19th century, again, these similar issues are still happening in the developing world today, which is why I believe that landscape architects working with allied disciplines have a critical role to play in these parts of the world. I'm very much inspired by Richard Weller, who's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, who developed a series of maps called the Atlas for the End of the World, which documents some of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. Many of these are in direct conflict with rapidly expanding cities in Asia and Africa, and how we design cities in these regions to protect sensitive habitats and reduce sprawl into natural areas and provide access to nature so that people still feel connected to the landscape within an urban environment is I think, very essential. One of the cities we're currently working in is Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, where we're helping the city envision a more equitable connection to its riverfront. The site consists of a former port defined by its industrial landscape of hard edges, historic custom houses, warehouses, and port infrastructure. But for over 150 years, those port activities prevented the adjacent neighborhood from accessing the river really for generations, leading to an inwardly focused community that lacked visual and physical connections to the water. This created an urban slum that many in the government would have liked to have seen torn down. But these neighborhoods are critical to the life of the city. So our goal became simply to upgrade these settlements humanely rather than eliminate them in the name of progress. In Ho Chi Minh, although that neighborhood adjacent to the port is a thriving district of about 183,000 people, it's historically been marginalized with significantly less open space than other more wealthy districts throughout the rest of Ho Chi Minh City. So our primary goal became a desire to increase the amount, the accessibility, and the connectivity of public open space throughout the entire district. To further complicate things, Ho Chi Minh City is also ranked among the top 10 global cities that are most vulnerable to climate change, with sea levels projected to rise about 10 inches or more by 2050. This image was taken immediately adjacent to our site. And I think despite the smile on the face of the person driving that moped, I don't think this is an enjoyable or an acceptable way to go about your daily commute. We therefore needed to design a series of edge treatments to respond to a variety of existing conditions and proposed conditions to protect not just new development, but the population of the entire district. The riverfront landscape is designed as a gradually ascending riparian zone that can accommodate these changing floodwaters over time. And the landscape also needed to work in tandem with architecture and seek ways to future-proof itself. I think in the not-so-distant future, when we hopefully have fewer cars and less underground parking due to advances in shared mobility, we can start to use those underground spaces and repurpose them for cisterns for storing some of those floodwaters. Streetscapes were also designed as water-receiving landscapes, diverting rainwater into those cisterns and bioswales rather than into existing city storm sewers. But the science behind the design and getting the public to embrace novel ways of designing cities is sometimes at odds. So to overcome any misconceptions, we hope to engage the public in a dialogue to walk them through how these urban improvements might impact their daily lives. Through interviews with local residents, we developed a series of avatars that are simplifications of the real people that we spoke with throughout the design process. We guided each of them through an example of what their daily life might look like and how they might use the various spaces that we were creating. Many were concerned about losing their cultural identity and wanted to protect the dynamism and the vitality of their current neighborhood. So we work with them to imagine what those upgraded streets might look like. Interior streets that offer shaded outdoor cafes, market plazas that create places to trade and to gather and celebrate, pocket parks that offer intimate escapes, and pedestrian corridors that recall Saigon's narrow alleyways. In addition to these active streets, we created 11 new civic plazas along the river where people could gather, whether for large events or just to catch up on daily gossip. And we did so as this richly textured experience that is meant to maximize exposure to differences, to diversity, and to the unexpected, and essentially the essence of what makes us social beings. My favorite of these plazas is across the river from Ho Chi Minh City's new soccer stadium, where we created a space that thrives on the energy of the stadium's noise and lights, and where the game can be broadcast on a floating screen that allows everyone to view the game in a public celebratory setting, again, even if you can't afford a ticket. So I don't know about you, but I would much rather be sitting in this plaza than a crammed seat of a stadium any day. Now, another fallacy that really bugs me is when people tell me that I'm lucky to have found my passion. For me, since when was passion singular or static? I'm willing to bet that everyone here has more than one passion. None of us are so one-dimensional as to only do one thing that we love. I'm passionate about food, I'm passionate about travel, passionate about landscape architecture, urban design, campfire stories, ecology, murder mysteries, advertising. I really love commercials. The list is extensive. I think all of you have long lists of things that you're really passionate about. I think passions evolve just as people do. I cringe when people ask my kids what they want to be when they grow up. What you're passionate about in this particular moment in time might not be your passion in the future. So you should always be open-minded to the new experiences and the new paths that life is leading you down. So don't chase your passion, and don't freak out if you haven't figured it out yet. That's what school is for. For me, I think what you should do is chase your purpose. Purpose is the reason that we journey through life. Passion's merely the fire that lights the way. One of my current purposes is figuring out what we as landscape architects can do to help the world adapt to climate change. I'm not the only one fighting this fight, but to me it means having a seat at the table to write policy, working upstream in planning, and understanding that it's a multifaceted global issue that landscape architects need to be involved in at all scales. In Wuhan, China, we're rethinking the existing waterfront to work more efficiently. This is the part of the lecture where I used to have to explain where Wuhan is. I don't have to do that anymore, thanks COVID. Wuhan's a really incredible city though, for those who have never been there, but its riverfront is a disaster. It's currently dominated by significant infrastructure and high levees. So the Yangtze Riverfront Park's existing conditions are this really repetitive, monotonous experience that's unsafe during seasonal flooding. It lacks kind of any cultural programming, and it offers very little ecological benefit, as you can see from the images here. But Wuhan and the Yangtze River have historically shared this very intimate symbiotic relationship until rapid urbanization, infrastructure, and higher levees really separated the river from its citizens. But living with the Yangtze is so deeply embedded in the DNA of Wuhan that people of all generations still frequent the riverfront, even when it's flooded, enjoying this intimate contact with the water. So straddling about a 10-kilometer stretch on both banks of the river, our design is meant to expand the park and provide really this landscape foreground to Wuhan's riverfront skyline to create this contiguous public waterfront. We began by organizing a variety of complex existing site conditions into 5 key spatial elements: the bridges, the barges, the marsh, the park, and the embankment. We then looked at what was damaged, starting with the site ecology. over the past 40 years, sediment in the Yangtze River has dropped by as much as 90% due to the construction of upstream dams like the Three Gorges Dam, which is really a serious threat to the river's ecologically beneficial mudflats. We need that sediment to provide the habitat for all of those little creatures that live in the mud and support the larger ecosystem. Our design, therefore, proposed wetland communities supported by very nuanced topographic changes, a really diverse planting palette based on inundation levels, and habitat elements including nesting platforms and loafing logs that contribute to the wetland's health. Frequent flooding, strategic dredging, and precise grading help to replenish the nutrient-rich sediment and reestablish distinct habitat zones that increase the biodiversity of those mudflats. We also looked at damaged infrastructure. There were remnants of Wuhan's freight train terminals where train cars would be transferred to barges to continue their journey downstream to Shanghai. And they were a significant existing element and a key component to honoring the site's industrial legacy. These industrial elements were then repurposed as public art. In low water, the park reveals its industrial heritage, recalling the riverfront's previous use, while rising water levels trigger an interactive light installation that accents the inundated remnants and highlights the river's power. Recommissioned gangways and catwalks provide access to floating stages for outdoor exhibits and performances, and seating areas are elevated to allow for the shows to go on even in flood conditions. Rethinking obsolete infrastructure was another key component of the plan. There were 68 barges and other infrastructural elements throughout the park that were initially slated for removal, and instead are being adaptively reused as floating gardens, performance stages, cafes, and art galleries. Many of these barges were already a little kind of vegetated island as the sediment deposited from that frequent flooding built up over time, and bird droppings or wind deposited seeds in that sediment and created pioneer species. So rather than removing them, we use those barges to form a planted promenade that rises and falls with the river and delineates this floodable plaza between them and the onshore levee. And we built that plaza out of this undulating metal mesh grid that, again, is floodable and can transform into islands for wildlife to rest when the plaza is submerged. The design for the park also went through an extensive public engagement strategy. We had open meetings, site tours, and a community arts program, including a living legacy project that documented the river's change over time through generations of family photographs. And that resulted for us in abundant feedback and provided programming ideas that directly influenced design iterations. To increase engagement, we also built a website to keep the public informed of the park's design progress, which helped us to solicit additional input from over 65,000 people, and it's definitely the largest public engagement process that I've ever been involved in. Now, a huge contributor to both climate change and public health that I feel isn't getting the attention it deserves is agriculture. You all talk about it here in Nebraska, probably more than most other places. And I'm a strong believer that landscape architects need to be at the forefront of rethinking our relationship with food. This is another area where I currently find purpose. With 10 billion people to feed on this planet, this is first and foremost a land use issue, and that's what landscape architects do best. What we're experiencing now is not the future I was promised when I was a kid. In the 1980s, astronauts were drinking Tang in space. Willy Wonka suggested that chewing a piece of gum would provide you with the same nutrition as eating a 3-course meal. Pan Am was going to give you a nutritional pill for your in-flight meal across the Atlantic. The Jetsons gave us this vision of a machine where our food would magically appear at the push of a button. But unfortunately, these visions of the future of food just led us down a path of convenient processed foods. Around the world, about 47 million acres of rainforest are lost every year to agriculture. In fact, agriculture is responsible for 90% of rainforest destruction. This destruction doesn't just release carbon, it also reduces biodiversity and increases the threat of diseases. By infringing on these ecosystems, we reduce the natural barriers between humans and the environment and those host species, which is creating these ideal conditions for diseases to spread. These microbes are not naturally occurring human pathogens. They become human pathogens because we offer them that opportunity by removing their habitat. Most of that land is used to grow commodity crops like corn and soy that are fed to animals so that humans can then eat more meat. I don't have time to get into all the details. That can be a whole separate talk. But all that's to say is that food as we know it today is completely unsustainable, and that we should really try to cut down on our meat until we have a better solution. I do a lot of work in China, and in China, the problem of growing cities is especially acute with people in agriculture competing for that same land. All of China's arable land lies in the eastern half of the country, which also corresponds to where about 93% of the population lives. This conflict's resulted in a sobering amount of land loss, agricultural land loss to development, about 123,000 square kilometers in just the span of a decade. For those of you that need a visual aid, that's just about equivalent to the size of the state of Iowa in ag land lost to development in China in 10 years. And of the farmland that remains in China, about 20% of it is contaminated soils. Again, for you visual folks, those polluted areas represent just about half the landmass of California. China's use of pesticides and fertilizers also rising faster than any other country on Earth, with really dire consequences. About 660 gallons of water are used to produce a single hamburger. And cattle production alone is responsible for about 80% of the planet's deforestation. In China, imports of beef have increased 19,000% in the last decade. So these trends really need to change. I'm not trying to make you feel bad about eating meat. It's just the problem that we've got a growing population that's eating a lot of it, and it has environmental issues. So right now we're working in Shanghai at the Sunqiao Urban Farm, where we designed a collection of vertical farms that will supply much of the city's leafy greens locally year-round and at an economically viable scale. Chinese cities are perfect for vertical farming. In fact, most cities are. But in Shanghai, the average diet consists of about 56% leafy greens. We should probably all be getting about half of our calories from fruits and vegetables anyway, but the point is that leafy greens are really a very viable crop for hydroponic systems. And according to research conducted by the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, these systems increase yields by 40 to 100 times what a traditional soil-based farm could produce. Sunqiao is also a living laboratory, allowing Shanghai's urban residents, many of whom have never seen a working farm, to learn about how food is grown. So I believe that vertical agriculture like Sunqiao needs to quickly become a fixture in cities around the world. Another paradigm that's changing how we think about the integration of agriculture and urban environments is at Songzhuan, which is about a 40 square kilometer new district on the outskirts of Beijing. At Songzhuan, we work to create a new development model that would embrace agriculture rather than displace it. So instead of the typical approach where development pushes the farms kind of aside, the idea is for development to embrace agriculture and make it part of the urban experience. This particular concept built off of the use of agriculture to support textiles and fashion, biotech, pharmaceuticals, really proving that entire economic sectors rely on agriculture to thrive, and that direct access to agriculture might help improve supply chain and foster more innovation and research. The Songzhuan model provides a direct connection between the land used to grow the resources we need for modern life and an understanding of our impact on it, as well as an appreciation for its scarcity rather than seeing the land as a commodity. This next project, Lim Chu Kang in Singapore, which as a small island nation faces limitations on available land and resources. In fact, about only 1% of Singapore's land area is dedicated for farming, which means they need to import nearly all of their food from other places. This is not a good position to be in from a food security perspective. But in Singapore, they're very, very progressive, and they have a new government agency, aptly named the Singapore Food Agency, which was established to shift this dynamic. Their mandate is for 30% of all food consumed in Singapore to be grown in Singapore by 2030. They call it the 30-30-30 approach, and that's just 7 years away. They've got to go from producing about 1% of their food to producing 30% of their food in country. So we developed a comprehensive plan for them that looked at scaling up agriculture operations to produce enough food to feed 1.7 million people annually. And not just that, but to position Singapore as a global leader for urban agriculture research and education, such that they can then create a new economic sector that will export this specialized knowledge to other cities around the world. Our concept, again, I love simple concepts, was called the Lim Chu Kang lunchbox. It's a metaphor for our version of a modular, stacked, and shareable urban agriculture district. Given the ambitious objectives of the project, we worked very collaboratively with engineers and agronomists to predict production yields and to calculate energy demand, water demand, and generated waste, and then to understand how each would contribute to an entirely circular closed-loop system. And though this necessitated that a majority of the land at Lim Chu Kang be dedicated to production in vertical farms, at the core we developed this immersive experience for people in this nation of foodies to learn about the future of agriculture. This is the Hawker Center, which evolves the idea of the traditional Singaporean food court, also known as hawker stalls, where visitors can do more than just eat in a food court. They can also learn how the food is grown in a vertical farm. They can pick their own ingredients and have robots bring them to them, and then participate in these live cooking demonstrations. Similarly, the Central Market is meant to be an immersive destination where visitors can shop, dine, listen to local music, or take courses at a culinary academy. And the idea is for it to become a new model for a more engaging, educational, and immersive supermarket experience. If you want more, you can book a stay in the farm village, where you can participate in traditional soil-based agriculture, harvesting food with your family to take home. And again, it's all part of an educational process designed to connect people to the land, but also to experimental technologies that illustrate how we can make farming more efficient and environmentally responsible. The auction arena also blurs the boundaries of entertainment and education, where food kind of takes center stage. Here you can watch food auctions as produce is sold to restaurants, hotels, and supermarkets, and follow live market prices. The goal is to make the cost of food production totally transparent. And along the main spine, the collaboration market and test plots make the research happening at Lim Chu Kang visible. It's also the home base for visiting scholars and students to learn from the innovation happening at Lim Chu Kang to bring back to their home cities around the world. And then finally, the logistics center is where food is processed, packaged, and shipped. But it's also an opportunity to get a behind-the-scenes look at these activities, including how agricultural waste is recaptured and turned into energy. Okay, prestige. The last word in my talk. For me, this is a complicated word. Again, I don't think any of these words, luck, glamour, passion, or prestige, are necessarily bad words. I just think they're nuanced. But I don't particularly like prestige as a word. To me, it implies exclusivity rather than inclusivity. It conveys power rather than compassion. I find it to be a pretty empty word, honestly. Again, in my role at SASAKI, I recognize that I'm in a position of power and privilege, but I don't think that should afford me or SASAKI or landscape architects or really any of us with any kind of prestige. But rather, it should come with a sense of duty and responsibility. As landscape architects, that's where we should focus our efforts, on stewardship, on equity, on environmental justice, and even more so with highly visible projects that others can experience and learn from. And I feel that's our responsibility at a firm like SASAKI and the impact that we're trying to have on the world today. One of the greatest responsibilities I think we have is to champion habitat conservation and be advocates for making biodiversity loss increasing awareness around that, really to advocate for species that can't speak for themselves and to foster biodiversity with every opportunity we have in every single project. Here we're working at the Chengdu Panda Reserve, which is a crazy fun project. The Panda Reserve is currently the most comprehensive facility in the world for genetic research, breeding, rehabilitation, and reintroduction of pandas into the wild. It's going through a really ambitious expansion from an existing 165-acre complex to over 16,000 acres. That's going to support amplified conservation efforts adjacent to the newly established Giant Panda National Park, which is China's first national park. This development pressure is real. Again, I'm channeling Richard Weller from Penn with this map from the Atlas of the End of the World that illustrates how the mountains of southwest China, which is the panda's primary remaining habitat, are falling below critical conservation targets. So the reserve is essentially the ex situ conservation strategy for the Giant Panda National Park. Its mission is to integrate scientific research and habitat restoration alongside public outreach and education. You can't have one without the other. And its expansion is meant to ease those development pressures for tourist-based projects on sensitive habitats near the national park. Obviously, everyone, country of 1.5 billion people, wants to come see pandas. Everyone who comes to visit China wants to see pandas. They want to go to this national park. How do you remove that visitation and put it in areas that are appropriate for it? So the expansion of the reserve proposes 3 distinct sites to combine, that are combined to support the reserve's overarching mission. So we have the Longquanshan Panda Village, which is the primary site for public education and visitation. There's the Beihu Panda Park, which supports research and breeding. And then there's the Zhujiangyang Panda Wilderness, which facilitates rehabilitation and re-entry of juvenile pandas into the wild. We began with a really rigorous landscape analysis that drove the reserve's expansion strategy. We did detailed studies of elevation, of slope, exposure, microclimate, hydrology, and vegetation to inform site selection. And we concentrated on locations that offered landscape typologies which closely resembled the preferred habitat requirements of pandas and their companion species. And although the reserve is located beyond the panda's established current habitat range, with GIS and on-site analysis of potential sites, this resulted in the prioritization of landscapes with characteristics that facilitate the rehabilitation of and the transition of those juveniles born in captivity to eventual release into the wild. I should note that no panda ever born in captivity has yet to have been released into the wild, and so this is the center that will be the first place to do that. New facilities were very carefully integrated into existing topography and were concentrated only on previously disturbed sites. We didn't impact any greenfield areas in the entire project. And landscape restoration strategies emulate native habitats and allow researchers to train juvenile pandas to acclimate to conditions in the wild, including seeking shelter, foraging for food, and perceiving danger. Researchers even dress up in panda suits to help facilitate this process. So if you're looking for a new career, I think this would be a really, really cool one. We did detailed plant inventories that documented species that pandas rely on for nutrition and shelter. And we also guided site selection and landscape restoration methodologies, including hydrological studies that were used to identify access to freshwater resources. And then we rewrote their entire enclosure guidelines manual, which were expanded from a current 600 square meters per panda to 15,000 square meters per panda. That's giving them a lot more of that natural habitat to roam. Now, visitation is obviously a very critical component of the reserve's revenue generation strategy, which helps to support and fund those conservation efforts. But the current facilities, you can see them in the photos here on the left, are really outdated and adversely impact panda well-being. So the redesigned exhibits leverage topography and vegetation, providing an immersive experience for humans while limiting disruption to those pandas. We also did a really meticulous spatial analysis that resulted in a design approach that prioritized animal health and comfort. Right now, the reserve is currently one of the top 5 most visited destinations in China. It gets about the same visitors a year as Disneyland, California. But the expansion plan distributes people to avoid crowds and noise near those habitat areas. You should note that the panda is also an umbrella species, so protecting the giant panda also benefits hundreds of other vulnerable, threatened, and endangered species that share its habitat. So we also created a management plan that looked at specific requirements for additional species that share the reserve's expanded facilities. We worked throughout this process in close coordination with zoologists, conservationists, and habitat specialists, including Dr. Jack Ma at Michigan State University, who literally wrote the book called Pandas and People. You couldn't have planned for a better consultant than that. And with him, we organized the reserve's landscapes into a matrix of ecological microzones that are most appropriate for those companion species, and then cited them according to those individual habitat needs. So the reserve essentially bridges this gap between zoo, nature center, and research complex, and also creates this kind of cultural destination where the updated facilities serve as an outpost for conservation scientists while providing a forum to educate visitors about the region's biodiversity and culture. Beyond pandas, the reserve's expansion presented an opportunity for various cultural experiences too. And to encourage external engagement with the reserve, we also developed a virtual program to complement the physical plan where the Panda Quest app can teach further new generations about conservation, and you can actually guide a panda on a journey through the landscape in search of food. And it also allows virtual visitors to donate, to volunteer, and to interact with the reserve from anywhere in the world, like collecting bamboo for the Panda Kitchen. Now, finally, I think the last responsibility that we have to act upon with more urgency is to reduce both operational and embodied carbon in all of our work, which is directly impacted by the design decisions that we make every day. One of the most carbon progressive projects we're working on right now that Yuja referenced, and I think potentially one of the most innovative landscapes in the world right now, and I say that with a lot of humility, having gone through this process, is the Ellinikon Metropolitan Park in Athens, Greece. The original Athens International Airport was decommissioned in 2001, and that led to about 20 years of figuring out how to create a funding and governance mechanism that would transform the city's largest piece of obsolete infrastructure, this old airport, into what's now becoming Europe's largest coastal park. This is about a 650-acre site, which is about 3/4 of the size of Central Park in New York City. It's larger than Hyde Park in London, and it really illustrates this kind of layered history of Athenian landscapes, including prehistoric coastal settlements that date to the Bronze Age, agricultural fields, an encampment for refugees, a 20th century airport, and a 21st century Olympic venue. This is where a lot of the venues for the 2004 Summer Olympics in Athens were located. But today, most contemporary Athenians don't have a home in the countryside, which really displaces this historical and cultural relationship with nature and the landscape. And similarly, a lot of the modern landscapes of Athens are either these really passive landscapes adjacent to ancient ruins, or they're hyper-urban plazas and streetscapes within the city. They don't really have a tradition of large recreational parks. So this is the site as it exists today. Lots of abandoned infrastructure surrounded by a really vibrant community that's fragmented and disconnected from the sea. It's currently the largest redevelopment project in Europe. So Ellinikon is going to ideally alleviate any development pressure away from the historic core of Athens. And the Metropolitan Park is serving as the centerpiece of this new mixed-use district. And we're also designing a 2-kilometer-long coastal front, which will be the largest public beach within Athens city limits. Now, most people think that landscape architecture is inherently sustainable. In fact, we started this journey thinking that we had a solid grasp of what sustainability and sustainable design looked like. But when we dug deeper, we realized that our preconceptions created a confirmation bias in our work. If carbon dioxide and related emissions are the biggest contribution to climate change, landscape architecture is just as culpable as any other design profession. So the reality is that global warming contributing emissions are associated with every action we take, every material we work with, every tree we plant, every act of construction. And it's really complicated. The more our team dug into the research on materials, construction methodologies, ecology, the more rigor we had to add to our really crude models for carbon accounting, and the further out of reach it seemed to achieve carbon neutral design. So we invented Carbon Conscience, which merges landscape infrastructure and architectural data sets into a rigorous database. We beta tested the platform on Alenicon, and most importantly, we made the app free for everyone. In short, Carbon Conscience is a whole project lifecycle assessment generator that accounts for material procurement, transportation, assembly, replacement costs, and sequestration. No other app right now merges all of those data sets together. So by using it to test design iterations, we were able to design Alenicon to reach carbon neutrality in 35 years. We also gamified the user interface to enable the most pathways for emissions reductions that allows users to instantly visualize the carbon impacts of design decisions. So this is really the only tool out there for kind of early stage design decisions in the concept phase of your process. So through this process, we discovered that big moves have big impacts, and that the most carbon savings happened in the planning and concept design phases when we were making decisions on land use typologies, like the amount of softscape versus hardscape, soil disturbance, plant selection, and materiality. We researched imports, exports, and local fabrication methods in Greece that inform the selection of materials, accounting for both transportation emissions as well as emissions resulting from manufacturing and assembly. We then used the results to guide our design. For example, we made a bold decision to reuse all of the concrete from the runways and tarmacs, essentially mining it and finding opportunities to use it playfully throughout the park. Like here at Olympic Square, which is one of the main gathering areas of the park, the design language of material reuse celebrates the site's heritage without being literal. Our signature fountain could easily have been built from granite or limestone or marble, which is plentiful in Greece, but instead it's sandblasted concrete from the existing runways. With its glimmering marble aggregate and no rebar, the existing concrete is also a really beautiful material. We obviously had to do a lot of hand-holding and education with the client around the aesthetic possibilities of this material. But what was once underground and unseen is now being honored. And it's also ubiquitous in the entire design, from the highly sculptural like fountains and retaining walls, to everyday objects like benches and paving, to purely functional like crushing it and using it for all of the subbase beneath our plazas and pathways. This early goal setting helped to build capital for client commitments to carbon positive design, and linked carbon forward thinking to all of our design decisions from concept through construction. So every decision was made with carbon kind of front and center. Here you can see the reclaimed concrete used as a massive retaining wall to create a dramatic cliff face that recalls the Acropolis back on the right of the screen. And also integrated as walkways, curbs, sculptural elements within planting areas, like at our Hilltop wine bar. In fact, not a single piece of material from demolition, over 150,000 cubic meters of existing material is leaving the site. It's all being put to use, every last chunk of concrete. We don't have one truckload of demo material leaving our site at all. We also reduce carbon emissions by adaptively reusing existing architecture. Athens has one of only 3 airports in the world designed by Aerosaarinen, the other 2 being the JFK terminal at New York's JFK and at Dulles in Washington, D.C. We reuse the historic terminal building as a cultural center and event center, and it's the centerpiece of this grand event space that terraces down to the sea. Now, Carbon Conscience also taught us with highly specialized outcomes based on the ecoregion and the specific plant species selection, just how critical our planting and ecological restoration strategies were to designing a carbon positive park. We use strategies like exclusive use of native and adapted species, in situ tree preservation, reuse of removed trees as landscape features, planting in groups for accelerated succession, saving the successional seed bank, biomass management for fire protection, and all of these species were selected for their ecosystem services and adaptability to the site's soils. We use reference ecosystems that inform carbon carrying capacity, and about 70% of the park is designed as a demonstration landscape of Greek landscape restoration that requires only annual maintenance, which means only about 30% of the park requires weekly or monthly care, and that helps to reduce the carbon as well. We also maximize sequestration by prioritizing species diversity, including soil biology, and with about 3.3 million plants in the park, we had to work with every single nursery in Greece to contract grow native species and to create seed mixes to establish a new, essentially a new standard for the industry. They had never used native seed mixes in Greece before. All of our nursery guys went out into the mountains and really foraged and harvested for these seeds from the Greek landscape, which was really fun to work with them. It's also Greece's first green infrastructure project. We have rain gardens, bioswales, flow-through wetlands, and all of the water for the park is being provided from an existing wastewater treatment plant. So we're not using any new irrigation. We actually only have irrigation for establishment vegetation. Obviously, this helps to maximize thermal comfort and reduce heat in the park as well, and can really help with the fountains and misting stations from all of that water, mitigate some of those summertime temperatures in Athens. We also centered nature in the design. We have 4 destination playgrounds throughout the park that create these immersive experiences for kids in the landscape. For older kids, there's progressively riskier play that gives them some independence. And then for the littlest kids, there are playgrounds that celebrate local wildlife and cultural symbols like the owl, which was always depicted with the goddess Athena, or the Rainbow Gate, which is one of 5 abstracted Olympic rings in one of the play areas. We also have a huge agricultural zone, which teaches about the site's history prior to its use as an airport when it was agricultural land. We have groves of citrus and olive and almond trees, which you can reserve for family gatherings like reunions, birthdays, weddings within the park. And all of that food provides produce for the park's cafes. And then finally, beyond the core of the park, we have the coastal front, which is the largest public beach in Athens, with amphitheater-style seating, hammock groves, a maritime-themed playground, a pedestrian bridge that crosses to the seafront along this kind of busy road. And the coastal front is a demonstration landscape of these restored dunes, salt marshes, and upland pine and oak habitats that reflect the Greek ecosystem. There's not a single piece of steel or concrete used in the entire coastal front. It's 100% natural materials in this area as well, including cobbles, stabilized stone dust, wood as all the primary materials there. We have a more kind of contiguous promenade adjacent to a Kengo Kuma designed Marina Galleria, Norman Foster designed Marina Tower there, all of which are kind of linked together by this coastal front, and even quieter moments, which are more intimately scaled that highlight the endemic plant species of Greece. And then finally, looking beyond construction to operations and maintenance, Carbon Conscious allowed us to calculate operational carbon emissions, factoring this into our design decisions as well. The entire park will be operationally net zero on the day that it opens. So the goal of Ionenicon is really to reinforce the Greek relationship with the landscape and to kind of reignite this ethos in a 21st century context. Now, I'm going to conclude with my last fallacy very quickly, which I didn't include in the title, but that's accolades, the validation from peers that we're kind of constantly seeking in our professional lives. Don't get me wrong, I think awards are awesome. They bolster team confidence, they help attract talent and clients, and they help to make what we're doing feel seen. But I think we should aim higher and ditch the navel-gazing mentality. And instead, what we should do is have our work measured by impact. So my goal at SASAKI is to make post-occupancy evaluations a part of all of our projects. We've just now begun a mandate to collect baseline data on all new projects. That's going to provide a foundation for doing this research. We did it at Jiading Park here in Shanghai, and it's much more gratifying to see the metrics proving our hypothesis than it is to kind of receive any award. When we started, the site was really a mess, but constructed wetlands improve water quality and encourage wildlife to return. We always prefer independent third-party research. We did this one with East China Normal University, and the results are really stunning. 66% less nitrogen and 97% less phosphorus in the landscape. And I think seeing some of these photos is way better to me when I know what we actually designed is working as intended. We didn't stop there. After Jiading, our design for Shuhui Runway Park received the first CITES Gold rating in China, and Julong Bay received the first CITES Platinum rating in Asia. In fact, SASAKI's designed 3 of the 5 CITES certified projects in China. Beyond the post-occupancy evaluations that we're doing more in-house, we go through CITES certifications on as many projects as we can. We're huge fans of the Landscape Architecture Foundation's Case Study Investigation and Landscape Performance Series programs to share all of that research more broadly with the profession. And at SASAKI, we also have our own internal research grant program, which is a competitive process that gives teams about $15,000 each to explore something that they're interested in. It helps to position us as thought leaders and get work from future clients. For example, our work for Sea Level Rise Boston helped us win the commission to write the Climate Ready Boston Plan and the Boston Heat Resilience Plan. And we're working on one right now called Climate Park Change, which looks at the impact of wildfires and other issues in the Intermountain West and Central states as a carbon impact that doesn't get as much attention as maybe coastal flooding and storm surge. Most of this internally funded research goes on to become much bigger things like carbon conscience, which then got a Landscape Architecture Foundation grant to explore it even further. And again, we could have chosen to make this database and this app completely proprietary, but I don't think doing that would have changed the world. So what inspires me at SASAKI is that this research is nonstop. At our most recent research fair in February, we were introduced to over 24 different ongoing projects, from creating building facades that double as bird habitat to how AI can be more effectively used in design. We've also committed to a nonprofit, the SASAKI Foundation, which is separate from the firm's research. It's meant to fund external researchers and then give them access to the resources in terms of the team and the knowledge at SASAKI. So we give those grants through a pitch night, through these community groups that come into SASAKI and talk about a problem that they want to solve. In addition, we donate about 10% of all of our profits to pro bono and low bono work, which kind of funds the social good that we're doing as a firm as well. So in addition to accolades and awards and even research, I think one of the most important things we need to be doing as landscape architects is messaging what we do to the masses. So I'm a huge proponent of getting our work into the mainstream media, not just to the benefit of the firm, but to increase the visibility and the credibility and the value of landscape architecture as a profession. I really want the world to know what we do, so I don't have to, like Ian McHarg, explain that I don't mow lawns in the summer or plow snow in the winter, but landscape architects are vital to the survival of the planet. So for me, advocacy is a daily activity. Beyond op-eds and articles and lectures, my most important work is instilling in my kids this deep appreciation for nature, and their wonder, their awe, their inherent desire for environmental justice is what inspires me every day and gives me hope for the future. And I think this manifests itself in what might seem like the smallest of ways, but are actually quite profound. Like earlier this year when I was helping them sort their Legos, and they commented that there weren't nearly enough green ones to build the parks that they needed. So for me, that innocent statement was a small win and validation of kind of what's happening around us in the real non-Lego world. So if I'm an advocate for anything, it's to move as far as you can, as much as you can, across the ocean or across town, walk in someone else's shoes, eat their food, live their culture. We have about 40% of SASAKians from outside of the United States, so we try to live this ethos every day. I think there's a huge world out there that's just waiting to be explored, but also to be cherished and protected. And landscape architects are some of the most equipped to help do that. So my goal is to make landscape architecture no longer parochial, but global, and contribute equally to human and planetary health. I think our societal issues are interrelated, they're interdependent, and they're international. So for me, working globally isn't glamorous, it's necessary, and I hope all of you consider it as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael, for this brilliant lecture. Now, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. Just raise your hand if you have a question, and then I'll hand over the mic to you. Oh, sorry.
As a landscape architect, you do a lot of development of land. What about the roofs of the cities, green roofs? How can they contribute to not only the agricultural and food production, but also for green environments, such for animals, for birds, in that type of environment?
Absolutely, that's a great question. At SASAKI, we have an internal policy that we won't work on any greenfield sites, which means that we're not doing development on any site that's currently untouched. And so where there is existing development, we're looking to maximize that open space. Roofs are a huge component of that. We look at green roofs from an environmental perspective and also a social perspective as kind of an additional use for people to occupy space. So a lot of our projects, I haven't shown, some of our more kind of acute urban work. I tend to work on bigger scale things, but we've done a lot of green roof projects that look at different types of environments on those roofs. In fact, we use our own office in Boston as a test case for that, where we have about a third of the roof is occupiable space for us to have outdoor gatherings as a company, and about 2/3 is a green roof system that captures stormwater on site and filters it down to cisterns in the basement. We also have beekeeping on the roof. We have some urban agriculture. Jack can tell you we had it at our previous office as well, where we had a lot of urban agriculture in our parking lot and on our back deck. So we see every landscape as an opportunity to contribute as a productive landscape, whether that's performative from an environmental perspective and a biodiversity perspective, or it's actually generating things like food for people in our office to eat. So yeah, as much as we can, we try to maximize the use of those spaces.
Okay, other questions? Yes.
So as a student, you mentioned passion as something that kind of guides you through life in a way. And I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do with, everything. So I was wondering, are there any specific tips for kind of, exploring some of that? I know you can kind of go broad with minors, kind of exploring through these lecture series and stuff like that. But is there anything specific to kind of focus our attention on exploring kind of the built environment and what we can do as designers?
And that's a great question, and that's so personal and individual that I think my advice could fall on deaf ears if I give it to you. So on the most basic level, I would say you got to find something that's going to get you out of bed every day, because you're going to spend 8 hours a day at your job, right? That's like a third of your day. It's got to be something you really love and you find passion in. and with people that you genuinely enjoy being around as well. So it's not just about you, and I think that's an important thing to remember, is that you can find something that you do and you love, but you also have to feed off the energy of those other people that are going to continue to guide you and you're going to learn from along the way. So don't just look at like the career path, look at the type of people that are working in that space. Are these people you want to be around? Do they have shared values? Are you going to have fun with them? Are you learning from them? Are these people that you want to spend a third of your day with every day? You know, so for me, that's like the most important thing in terms of choosing a career. I wouldn't want something that was insular or isolating. I wanted something that kind of fed off the energy of other people, that I would have stimulating dialogue and conversations and debates with. So really, I want to, you know, for me, it's about surrounding yourself with people that are smarter than you, because then you're always going to be learning. You're always going to find something interesting in that. So I think that's like the number one thing for me, is like find your people, and then the career will kind of emerge from that.
Okay, maybe I'll add a question here. So there seems to be a role of duality within what landscape architecture and I guess broadly the design disciplines do. There's, you know, you're advocating for people, at the same time you're advocating for the environment, you're advocating for you know, advancement of ecologies, but also, you know, being able to facilitate what people wants to do. There's also the enchantment of design and also the rational aspect of the design. There's so there seems to be you know, two roles that you're almost playing. How do you view that in your work? Because a lot of it is, you know, planning for development.
I think that duality is manufactured. I think we forget that humans are one of many complex species on this planet, and it's not our role to dominate that or to control that, but to coexist with that. And I think that's where design needs to be heading, is not managing nature, but coexisting with nature and finding our place within it, and using our massive brains as, you know, the pinnacle species on the planet, as this apex species, to find a way to allow all of those systems to coexist together. And I think when we start thinking with that frame of mind, rather than kind of engineering ourselves out of everything, then we'll start to get into a better place where that duality doesn't exist anymore. And I also think, you know, to your question about design, like, for me, aesthetics is a cultural construct. We've decided what looks good based on this moment in time. What looked good 100 years ago, 200 years ago is very different than what we think looks good today. So we need to stop thinking in terms of beauty and poetics and think more in terms of performance and function and planetary health as our guiding principles around design, not symmetry, not beauty in the current way we represent it. And I think for the Alenicon project, that was a big shift that we made with the client very early on. You know, our early design sessions, they were talking about marble benches and marble this and marble that, and, you know, it's grease and it's marble. And we're like, you have a resource right here, which is also beautiful. They didn't think it was beautiful until we had a contractor cut out a big slice of that concrete, bring it out of the ground, polish it, and it looked like terrazzo. And we said, once we started as the expert designers saying this is beautiful, then they believed it's beautiful too. And you don't realize how much power you have as a designer to redefine what aesthetics is. So we can redefine how humans interact with nature and the planet. We can redefine what's perceived as being beautiful if it has a kind of performance metric associated with it. And I think kind of separating design and beauty from all of these other things that we need to be doing as a society and a culture and as stewards of the planet, which is really what we are as landscape architects and as humans, then we're going to get to a place where we're actually solving big issues and not just perpetuating even more.
Yes.
Yeah, so you spoke about the development of Central Park and how people were getting pushed out of that area so the park could be made. In today's day and age, how is that conversation happening between trying to fit these known to be beneficial green spaces in big cities and without, pushing people out like it has happened in the past?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue. And I think, we talk about environmental justice communities in this country. I think it's finally becoming more centered in our dialogue. We recognize that displacement is kind of a non-starter for many communities, at least in democratic countries. It still happens in a lot of these emerging economies around the world. China, certainly, any kind of authoritarian regime where they can make big decisions. Now, you can argue that some of them are for the greater good versus kind of individual human impact. But my personal belief is that every human impact, every human life is important and needs to be treasured. So we need to think about that first and foremost. And I think the modern dilemma we have is not so much displacement as it is gentrification and kind of the de facto displacement that comes with that by creating this asset that increases real estate values, but the people who own that real estate are the 1% or the few and don't allow those communities to thrive. And I think where we're finally heading as a profession is valuing community engagement and understanding kind of a community's needs as the primary generator for all of our design decisions and not kind of a secondary thing that you have to do as part of the process. And so that kind of centering of the people who are going to occupy the space you're designing needs to be at the forefront of your thinking. And there has to be a plan in place for how you can create kind of co-benefits from an economic perspective for all those people to remain in place. And I think that's the challenge of landscape architecture in an urban environment today is making sure that what we're doing isn't continuing to benefit the few, but considers the needs of the many.